The office lamp had been on for 19 hours. Kieran didn't notice when the building's fluorescent lights flickered off at midnight, or when they hummed back to life at 6. The equations on the whiteboard had multiplied like accusations, recursive, branching, refusing resolution. He'd solved it. Again. The third variation of the proof sat complete in his notebook, margins filled with corrections to corrections, each iteration tighter than the last. Beautiful, even, the kind of work that should matter. But perhaps what disturbs us most isn't failure. It's succeeding in a language no one bothers to learn. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being right in ways people find inconvenient. Not the dramatic kind of being silenced or suppressed, nothing so clean. Just the slow realization that your clarity makes others uncomfortable, so they've learned to smile and look past you. Kieran had spent 12 years in this gap. He worked in theoretical physics, specifically emergence theory, how complexity arises from simple rules, how order appears from chaos. His papers circulated in certain circles. Graduate students quoted him in footnotes. Researchers in Berlin and Singapore sent careful emails asking if they'd interpreted his work correctly. But the university wouldn't hire him. 5 applications, 5 polite rejections. Your work is rigorous. We're looking for someone whose research aligns more closely with departmental priorities. Translation: we don't understand what you do, and that makes us nervous. So he adjuncted, taught introductory mechanics to undergraduates who thought physics was about memorizing formulas, graded papers in coffee shops, published in obscure journals that didn't require institutional affiliation, lived in a one-bedroom apartment where the shower pressure dropped every time someone flushed a toilet 2 floors down, and kept working, because stopping felt like erasure. The confusion wasn't about the work itself. Kieran knew, with the kind of certainty that feels both like clarity and like madness, that his approach was sound. He could see structures others missed, patterns that revealed themselves only if you were willing to sit with ambiguity long enough for it to organize. But the drive to continue had started to feel less like passion and more like defiance against irrelevance. If he stopped, what would be left? Not the teaching. That was obligation, not identity. Not the university. They'd made it clear he was conditionally welcome, useful for covering sections no one else wanted, invisible otherwise. Just the work, and the quiet, creeping suspicion that the work had become a way to avoid asking whether anyone actually needed it. You know that feeling when you finally try to explain something that's lived in your head for years, and the person across from you just goes still? Not disagreeing, not confused, just politely waiting for you to stop talking so things can return to familiar ground. That was what it felt like every time Kieran tried to explain his work at faculty mixers. So it's kind of like chaos theory? Not exactly. It's about how simple rules— Right, fascinating, they'd say, already scanning the room. Have you tried the Samosas? He learned to stop mid-sentence. But here's the strange part. The work kept mattering to him, even as the isolation deepened, even as he watched younger researchers, people who played the academic game better, who knew which advisors to flatter, which conferences to attend, get positions he'd been rejected from. He still woke up thinking about the equations, still felt that sharp, quiet thrill when a proof clicked into place, still believed, against all evidence, that understanding something true was worth the cost. And maybe that's where the confusion lived. Not in doubt about the work, but in the growing gap between the value he felt and the value anyone else seemed to assign. The lamp flickered. Kieran looked up, realizing his neck had gone stiff. The whiteboard was covered. 3 columns of derivations, corrections in red marker, annotations in the margins. He'd been at it since yesterday afternoon. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of footsteps overhead. Outside, the university town was waking up, students shuffling to early lectures, the coffee shop downstairs opening its metal grate. He should sleep, but the thought of stopping, of closing the notebook and pretending tomorrow would be different, felt impossible. So he kept working. There's a type of productivity that looks like discipline but functions as avoidance. Kieran had started to suspect he was living in it. Not avoiding the work, avoiding everything else, avoiding the question of what happens if you spend your entire life building something no one asked for, avoiding the growing possibility that being understood and being valued are not the same thing. He had colleagues who left academia, moved into industry, data science, consulting, made twice his salary solving problems they found boring. "You'd be great at it," one of them said over drinks last year. "You think in systems. That's all they want." Kieran smiled, nodded, ordered another beer, and gone home and worked until 4 a.m. Because leaving felt like admitting the 12 years had been wasted, and he couldn't afford that arithmetic. The invitation arrived in March. A conference, small, specialized, emergence and complexity in physical systems, hosted by a research institute in Norway. They wanted him to present. Not as a keynote, even not as a featured speaker, just a 40-minute session in the afternoon block, along with a dozen other researchers whose work lived in those same neglected corners of theoretical physics. But still, an invitation. Kieran read the email 3 times, looking for the polite rejection he'd trained himself to expect. Found none, just a straightforward request, a panel slot, a modest honorarium that wouldn't cover the flight, but would cover meals. He accepted. You'd think recognition would feel like relief. It didn't. It felt like exposure, because now he'd have to stand in a room with people who actually understood the work. People who'd read his papers not out of politeness, but because they were wrestling with the same questions. People who might see very clearly whether what he'd been doing alone for 12 years actually held up. The thought made his hands shake. He spent 2 months preparing the presentation. Not because it was complicated. The work was already done. The proofs were sound. He could have presented in his sleep. But because he needed it to be perfect. Every slide rebuilt 4 times, every transition scrutinized, the explanation compressed, expanded, compressed again, practicing out loud in the apartment until the neighbors probably thought he'd lost his mind. The drive hadn't softened. If anything, it had sharpened into something desperate. This was the moment, the validation he'd been working towards without admitting he needed it. If they understood, if they saw what he saw, then maybe the 12 years hadn't been a mistake. Maybe the isolation was temporary. Maybe he'd been right all along, just waiting for the right audience. And if they didn't, he didn't let himself finish that thought. The conference was held in a modern glass building overlooking a fjord. Kieran arrived a day early. The hotel room had that anonymous stillness all hotel rooms have. Clean, temporary, indifferent. He sat with his laptop open, staring at slides he'd already memorized, changed one transition, changed it back. A walk along the water didn't help. The rehearsal in his head kept looping on the same explanations, the same moments where he worried the logic might sound too abstract, too distant from what people expected. Back in the room, the laptop opened and closed in cycles he stopped tracking. Each time the same slides, the same certainty they weren't quite right. The night before his presentation, sleep wasn't even a possibility. The panel session started at 2 p.m. 12 people in the audience, mostly researchers, a few graduate students, one older woman in the back taking notes by hand. Kieran stood at the podium, opened his laptop. The first slide appeared on the screen behind him. Emergent stability in non-equilibrium systems, a recursive framework. He began, and for 40 minutes he explained what he'd been seeing for 12 years. The audience listened, not politely, actually listened. A few took notes, One researcher in the front row nodded at a particular derivation. Another leaned forward during the section on recursive feedback loops. When Kieran finished, there was a pause. Then the woman in the back raised her hand. "This is elegant work. Have you considered applying this framework to neural synchronization models?" Kieran blinked. "I hadn't, but yes, that could work." Another hand, a younger researcher. "Your approach to stability thresholds, does it hold under stochastic perturbations?" "It should. I'd need to run simulations, but theoretically, yes." The questions kept coming, not challenges, genuine curiosity, extensions, applications he hadn't thought of. They understood.
After the session, 3 people approached him. One wanted to collaborate. Another invited him to contribute to a volume they were editing. The woman in the back suggested he apply for a fellowship at her institute. "We need people who think like this," she said. Kieran nodded, smiled, shook hands, collected business cards, and felt nothing. Not relief, not validation, just a strange, quiet flatness. He flew home 2 days later. The apartment looked the same, the whiteboard still covered in equations, the notebook open on the desk. He sat down, stared at the work, and realized the recognition had arrived too late. Not in time, too late emotionally, because somewhere in the 12 years, the need for validation had curdled into something else. The drive had stopped being about being understood and started being about proving he could survive without it. He'd built an entire identity around not needing what he'd just received. And now that he had it, now that people were interested, now that collaboration was possible, now that the work might finally reach the audience it deserved, he couldn't feel it. The exhaustion had outlasted the hunger. Kieran opened the notebook. The equations were still beautiful, the logic still held, but the urgency was gone. He'd wanted this, worked for this, structured his entire life around the belief that if the work was good enough, recognition would follow, that understanding would arrive, that the isolation was temporary. And he'd been right. It had arrived, just not in time to matter the way he thought it would. There's a particular kind of loss that comes from getting what you wanted after you've already adapted to not having it. Not bitterness exactly, not even regret, just the quiet realization that the person who needed the validation no longer exists. You've become someone else, someone who learned to survive without it, and now that it's here, you're not sure what to do with it. The notebook stayed open for a while longer, then it didn't. The lamp went dark. Kieran sat in the stillness, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the muffled voices from the floor above. The fellowship application sat in his inbox, the invitations to collaborate, the edited volume. He'd respond, probably, but not tonight. Tonight, he just sat with the understanding that success, real, tangible, earned success, had arrived exactly when he'd stopped needing it to save him. And somehow, that made it feel like the saddest proof of all. This is the quiet trap of endurance. We survive by learning not to need what we're chasing, and by the time it arrives, we've become people who no longer recognize its value. The goal remains unchanged, but we've changed too much to feel it the way we thought we would. As Seneca wrote, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. And perhaps the waste isn't always in distraction. Sometimes it's in the years spent proving we don't need what we're desperately working towards, only to discover we were right. These thoughts don't resolve easily. They linger in that strange space between understanding and acceptance. If something here feels familiar, you're not alone in recognizing it. I'll be waiting in the next one.